Oh, it's you.
You know her?
It's been a long time. How have you been? I've been really busy being dead. You know. Depression is a hell of a drug here at the end of the world.
Oh no!
Okay, look. Please forgive my apparently broken microphone during the parts of this video where I am behind the camera. I didn't know until after I had already recorded. I will fix it before the next one. I will say though that since you went to all the trouble of waking me up, you must really, really love to watch poorly doctored content. I love it too. There's just one small thing we need to take care of first.
I always knew there was something different with me, but I refused to actually verbalize what it was. Even though I didn't really know why I couldn't say anything to anyone, I knew that I was somehow wrong. I mean, growing up in the environment and culture we grew up in, how could I ever say anything? And who would I say it to? Again, and again, and again. Every minute of every day, I wondered why I had to deal with the things I had to deal with. And every single night, I prayed for God to let me wake up as a girl, and for no one to have ever known me as anything different, so that I didn't have to deal with the shame of being trans. It's not something I would wish on anyone. When I sit to write these videos, it's never my intention to be overly negative. There are even times I go into things with the intent of being anything but. But it's also true that the two overarching topics I typically choose to discuss on this channel, fascism and trans stuff, tend to naturally always be a bit dark. This is obviously especially true with fascism, as there is not a single positive thing that can be said of that ideology or its history. In fact, videos about fascism tend to have a marked effect on my mental health. While the feeling as though I'm doing important work has its own satisfaction, the sheer number of hours I've spent in the past year combing through fascist video clips, texts, and history has, at times, been pretty overwhelming. By the time I finish with many of those videos, I have to take like a week to just chill out and consume literally anything else. Trans issues are obviously a different matter altogether. I mean, to state the obvious, the trans agenda isn't an ideology based on hate, genocide, and ultranationalism. It's an ideology based on using anime and video games to seize the means of production. But transition hasn't been all e-girl glam for me. It's also been e-girl clout chasing. Are these online trans femme jokes landing? Maybe 2 one-liners in a row is excessive. Excessive like this. Unfortunately, and to the surprise of no one, many aspects of the trans experience are pretty dark. It was that darkness, in fact, that led me to start making YouTube videos in the first place, as that seemed to be one way I could use my writing and experiences to affect positive change. I think that's what leads so many trans folk to pursue online content creation and other forms of internet activism, even if the name recognition requisite to be successful in that type of activism does eventually turn us all into whatever your gender's equivalent to Regina George is. Looking at you, every single trans Twitter account larger than me. Seriously, these are some pretty niche jokes, but don't forget to follow me on Twitter. Ugh. And while we are still in the introduction, I should mention the fact that while greater trans visibility is a good thing and has led to some marginal improvements to the lived trans experience, there is a parallel reactionary movement that is explicitly transphobic, explicitly opposed to any sort of trans liberation. Look at the wave of state-level anti-trans bills that have been passed recently. The language may often be couched in the dog whistle of protecting women's sports, and protecting women's bathrooms, and protecting lesbians, as if most people who use such language ever gave a shit about protecting lesbians before it became politically convenient for them to do so. But the subtext is obvious. Trans people, perhaps especially trans women, are a threat to the fabric of society and should not be allowed to exist. And oh so often, the trans experience is painted as being so miserable that it is utterly devoid of joy, and therefore, always a mistake. Because of this, you'll even see language that denying trans acceptance is also important for protecting trans people themselves. Unfortunately, despite the mental gymnastics that are required for upholding such an absurd position, I have unwittingly played into it at times. Until relatively recently, I was pretty bitter about being trans. And there will inevitably be some cis people in the audience who will hear that and blithely think something to the effect of, "Then why did you trans then?" Which of course I tried, but after 28 years, I still couldn't find a better way to get power from the engine to the differential. That one was a mechanic joke. I was one of those trans people whose dysphoria was so bad that I didn't really have a third option past transition and suicide, and so it was only after I realized that I would otherwise never have even had a chance to one day play Cyberpunk 2077 that I begrudgingly transitioned. For better or worse, this, coupled with many of the more negative experiences I had early in transition, is often reflected in what I write about with regards to my experiences with being trans. Which again, fine, because like I said, I do what I do to draw attention to those things. And I don't know if it's simply the bias in the type of trans YouTube content I consume, but I've found that the ways in which other trans people discuss their experiences are also often negative, probably for the same reasons. But as my second year of YouTube content creation drones on, I find that a lot of my early attitude and bitterness have changed pretty significantly. Yeah, there are definitely days that still suck, and for as much allure as it gives me to such a wide swathe of people, I still cry about the thing between my legs at least once every couple or 3 days. But you know, honestly, even taking all that into account, I kinda like being trans now. I certainly wouldn't change it, even if I had the option to have magically been born a cis woman. So that's a pretty dope realization. And what better topic for a video? It's definitely nice to be able to start the second half of the year on a high note. Or nearly start it, whichever ends up being the case. I don't know, honestly, this is an old script I've resurrected because the other one I'm working on is taking me so long. And honestly, I'm not even sure when this one is going to be finished. So I say high note, but it's still kind of sad in places, but come on, I mean, that's still pretty good for me. Gotta stay true to the sad girl aesthetic.
I feel fantastic and I'm still alive.
Baby.
Part 1. It's a unique experience.
For pretty much my entire life prior to transition, people would probably have described me as a nice, inoffensive, nerdy, sad boy. I like to think that now I'm only like 1.5 of those things, but I don't get to decide how other people see me. I read a lot of books, played a lot of video games, and after high school, I got really into mechanics. When I was much younger, I was sometimes compared to the main character on The Pagemaster, a movie which I admittedly loved, and a character with some obvious similarities to me. I was bullied quite a lot for being gay, long before my sheltered ass even knew what that word meant, and perhaps as a result of that experience, I tried to treat everyone with kindness. Politically, I was fairly centrist, likely again through some internalized belief that it was the kindest position, because it allowed me to avoid making any sort of strong stance on anything, though for a time I did identify as libertarian.
You know, it's tough. I agree with the Latin kings on social issues, but fiscally, I'm more of an Aryan.
Well, juggling both never ends well. Mr. Peanut Butter, anything to contribute? He's just staring blankly now.
I've already talked about all this at some length in a previous video, but I have a bit more to add to it in a bit. Everyone has a different attitude and approach to their pre-transition memories, and I don't have any reason to believe that one is better than the other. There are cases where people choose to disconnect themselves entirely from who they were before, either literally or figuratively. I mean, I've heard more than one story of trans people who eventually choose to burn old pictures and belongings, and I mean, I get it. I'll be the first to admit that seeing old pictures of myself can stress me out a ton, even though I put them on these videos a lot, including this one. And I hate hearing my dead name. That said, there is a certain beauty to the trans experience of having lived years as a gender that's completely incongruent with one's present reality. And that doesn't mean that it's not traumatic. God knows it doesn't mean that. It just means that depending on your perspective, it doesn't have to be an entirely traumatic thing. On October the 25th, 2005, the fourth installment of Sid Meier's Civilization was released, and PC gaming history nerds around the world sat in awe of the most incredible title screen ever to grace our square little analog LCD monitors. I was 15 at the time and had only just recently discovered and become obsessed with Civ 3. Civ 4 was a revelation, and it was within that first week of release that my LAN group got together at a friend's house to share the single copy that had been bought, as well as the crack that had been downloaded from the Pirate Bay. There were 5 or 6 of us awkward, sweaty, nerdy teenage guys in that little living room, Athlon 64 chips frying cheerfully to Leonard Nimoy's delightful narration.
When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist.
I believe I played as Louis XIV in that game, or maybe Alexander. Hard to remember, those were before my days in service to the Connaught. That was one of my most treasured high school experiences. Even in that moment, I knew it was something special, and I wouldn't now trade that memory for the world. And most likely, I would never have had that experience had I been born a cis girl rather than a late-blooming trans one. Not that cis girls can't have the sort of nerdy, male-dominated experiences I had, but the likelihood of that happening in rural West Kentucky back in 2005 are slim at best. There were certainly none in that room at that moment. In that same vein, of course I'm devastated I didn't get to go to prom as a girl. And I feel absolutely crushed anytime I consume a piece of media about high school lesbians awkwardly falling into secret, tragic love with one another. There is basically an endless list of good and awkward and downright terrible experiences that I will never have because they were denied me when I was younger. I've spent countless hours being sad about those things. But the thing is, I can't change any of that. And while there's nothing wrong with being sad about sad things sometimes, it's not like that memory of Civ 4's release can't still be a good one, a unique one that I likely would not have had otherwise, and one that I've decided is pretty freaking cool for me to have had. Ditto for the countless hours I spent in summer garages wrenching on ancient iron, the years of baseball and boys track and cross country, the guys trip I took to New Orleans when I was 18. Those are good memories, and while they may not make up for the ones I never got to have, I would not have had them otherwise, and each of those experiences gave me insights that I likewise may not have ever gained. So, yeah, I like that I got to do those things. Hi. Peek behind the curtain, if you will.
Part 2. It made me Wait, I'm not reading that.
My life prior to transition was a comfortable one. Okay, like, at least extrinsically.
If you don't count the way people treated me. Okay, so like, what I'm trying to...
Look, you know what I'm trying to say. I had tons of privilege. I was treated as a straight white Christian male in the American heartland, and I mean, that's the lottery right there. You can't get much higher short of wealth. For all practical purposes, I grew up in the Shire. I was completely isolated from the darkness and suffering and evils gathering in the rest of Middle-earth. And the place where I grew up may have been ignorant, and I was certainly ignorant by extension, but I was comfortable. You know, I never had to think about other people because there really were no other people I was ever in contact with. I simply got to reap the benefits of empire without ever stopping to think how bananas were only 50 cents a pound at Kroger despite never having laid eyes on a banana tree. It's no wonder, therefore, that in an environment like that, I grew to eventually regard anything political as bad because, to me, political just meant anything that was unnecessarily divisive or would have caused me to question my reality in a way that I simply wasn't capable of doing at the time. It didn't help that I was basically discouraged by all my elders around me to ever discuss or even think anything political. I held no strong political beliefs other than the ones that were funneled into me. Liberals and conservatives were both stupid, but like everything else, it's a bit different now. At the time, I thought being politically polarized just meant that you were too stupid to compromise on anything, and obviously all things are and ought to be a compromise. Radical centrism allowed me to feel as though I was rebelling in an acceptable way, while also giving me a sense of intellectual superiority without having to do any of the work of actually standing for anything. Later, in 2008, I committed the most overt act of political insurrection to that point in my life by supporting Ron Paul instead of John McCain, because the only thing less political than centrism to my ignorant 18-year-old mind was American libertarianism, because government regulation, bad. Wait a minute. Wasn't this a trans good video? Why the hell am I talking about the history of my political beliefs? Again. To which I would say, this is still my damn channel. Hold your horses. We're getting there. So good. Even though I saw myself as a libertarian, I remained pretty apolitical for the next several years, though I was slowly becoming more liberal. Finally starting to see the world outside of the Shire will do that to you.
This is it. This is what? If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been.
My gradual journey towards social liberalism in no way prepared me for the den of softcore leftists that was trans Reddit in, like, 2014. See, I told you I'd get there eventually. In fact, my visceral response to, who are all these socialists, kept me safe in my little egg for a few more years to come. But here's the thing. The more I slowly came to grips with the fact that I could be trans, the more I couldn't deny how shitty my previous political positions had been. Even if I still looked the same as I always had, even if I still acted the same way as I always had, I was no longer in the Shire. As hard as I tried, I couldn't deny who I was, and even if I didn't act on it, I knew in my heart how I would be treated if I did. You know, the whole you can never step in the same river twice thing.
我本是男儿郎，又不是女娇娥。错了，又错了。我本是男儿郎，又不是女娇娥。
One piece at a time, I started to see all the little injustices and oppressions here and there, and even if they didn't affect me personally, it was becoming harder and harder to turn a blind eye to them. But I tried to, just as I tried to ignore my own struggles with dysphoria. In 2016, I supported Bernie, but I also still saw myself as largely apolitical. When my egg finally shattered in May of 2018, all of my conflicting emotions about politics became overwhelming.
No! We're not gonna do it, Angelica! It's just not fair! We want dimes! We want dimes! Tommy. We want dimes! 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 We want dimes!
I vividly remember, right around that time, browsing r/trans or some other such sub and exasperatedly thinking, ugh, are all trans women just a bunch of communists? To which I can now say, probably not all of us. But it was only when I began to transition, when I started to experience actual marginalization for the first time in my life, that I finally stopped trying to ignore all the obvious evils of the world around me. How could I keep up that charade? I went from being treated as a man to being treated as a woman, from straight to gay, from cis to trans. The felt effects of that were immediate and overwhelming. And I still have all the privileges that come with being white. Trans femmes of color have seriously got to be the strongest people in this, or perhaps any, country. I might have lived my life to that point trying to be the kindest, nicest, good person you ever saw, but empathetic? Maybe a little, but only if I'm being especially charitable to my pre-transition self. Empathy is a skill I only learned through transitioning, which is in no way a declaration that cis people are somehow incapable of empathy. It is very much, however, a declaration of the fact that I would have nowhere near the degree of empathy I have now were I not trans. Okay, but why bring politics into this? Because one is inextricable from the other. My politics before centrism and libertarianism were the political stances of someone who benefits from the inequity of our society and who is incapable of truly putting themselves into the shoes of another. Someone more interested in maintaining respectability than helping those who need it most. I still don't really enjoy being invested in politics, but becoming a part of a marginalized community and learning to be more empathetic have shown me that the only people who can afford to be apolitical are those who do not suffer under our current system, those who would not benefit from it changing. I hate that it took me so many years to realize that, but better late than never. Hey, baby. Yeah, hi.
Part 3. It taught me how to be a really good brat.
Earlier, I mentioned the bullying I received during my teen years for being an alleged gay. If you've watched any of my other stuff, you know that this is something that I make relatively frequent reference to. So when talking about this, I always make a point to say something along the lines of, obviously it was an awful traumatic experience, I wouldn't wish it on anyone, and bullying like that shouldn't even exist in the first place. But it is something that made me a lot stronger. I was an extremely passive child, and bullying is what taught me to stand up for myself, as gross as it is to say that out loud. My many years since then have seen that passivity gradually worn away, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's complicated. My experiences since starting transition have 100% been a continuation of that process, because the mindset of transphobes and the mindset of homophobic middle school bullies are entirely the same thing. It's fear turned cruelty, ignorance, and a need to distract from one's own problems and shortcomings by posturing oneself as being superior to another person.
Look, we could have an AIDS-free world by Christmas. You know, or okay, it wouldn't be totally AIDS-free, but we'd be like 90-some% AIDS-free by Christmas if we would follow this. Okay, here's what the Bible says, Leviticus 20:13. If a man also lie with mankind, as he lieth with the woman, okay, it says, even both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death, their blood shall be upon them. And that, my friend, is the cure for AIDS. It was right there in the Bible all along.
Incidentally, fascism is the same thing on an ideological scale. See, I told you I had a reason for taking a detour to talk politics. Trust the writing process. When finally I broke down and decided I had to transition, I realized that I only had two options: to eventually come out publicly and risk losing everyone I knew, or to run away and, risk losing everyone I knew. So the trick was really to choose which method I preferred to lose people through. As you can imagine, that makes for a pretty tough decision, the sort of decision that can make for a pretty lasting impact. I'm not sure whether this is a universal experience or not. Perhaps in some places, people are generally kinder and more accepting of queer people than they are back home. It was certainly true for me, having come from a place so evangelical that "what church do you go to?" is a common greeting, and where you can throw a rock and hit 3 diesel brodozers flying Trump flags. Being trans is antithetical to every single thing I was taught to aspire to growing up, and transition would therefore be an open act of defiance unlike anything I had ever performed before. Rebellion of that magnitude, one which necessitates accepting the fact that you may literally lose everyone in your life for committing it, necessitates finding enough strength within yourself to counteract all that you might lose from everyone else. Would I have ever found that strength had I not stood at the literal threshold of suicide? I can't say. I like to think that I may have eventually found myself capable of it, but in truth, I'm not so sure. Regardless, a choice like that fundamentally changes a person, and just like with the bullying, I would never wish a choice like that on a person. It's not an experience that should even exist. But I am a far, far better, happier, and stronger person than I would ever otherwise be had I never had to face that crossroads. So in an odd, probably inexplicable way, I'm thankful for it. I've often explained my pre-transition life as one where I was but a log on a river, carried to whatever direction the channels around me flowed. It's not so much that I was powerless to direct my own path, but rather, I simply had no interest in doing so. I really had no interest in doing much of anything but seeing the river's end. I craved death, but resented the fact that if I did die, it would be inauthentically, a secret clutched to my heart to the very end. Transition has carved that log into a little canoe, and while there are certainly still times where the current overpowers my will to conquer it, I'm no longer interested in being a passive traveler. I want to see every rock, tree, and creature along the way. I want to stop for little picnics along the bank. And the thing is, I don't want to die anymore. I want to live to be 97 and experience every single thing I can in that time. But if I were to die tomorrow, I would do so contentedly and smiling, because I would be doing so after having lived authentically, as myself. And after a lifetime of doing otherwise, that is an incredibly peaceful feeling. It is also extremely empowering. Turns out, having a will to live despite what others think goes a long way to freeing oneself from the heavy psychological restrictions placed on us by society. Hell, it was only through defying the transphobic parts of my culture that I began to see all the innumerable other ways we are conditioned to accept the order we live under. Transitioning publicly requires a sort of ego death, and as scary as that sounds, there is nothing more socially, intellectually, or emotionally liberating than letting go of such conditioning. I can't speak as to the conditions under which others are bullied, I can only speak to my own. But what I can say is that, in my case, the only power that the bullies had over me was that which I ceded to them. Nothing of my circumstances fundamentally changed once the bullying ended. What changed was my perspective. I realized that I really didn't have any reason to care at all what they had to think of me, even if I still did a little. And once I stopped showing that I cared, they stopped caring to bully me. Discourse around bullying usually starts and stops at K through 12, but really what I found is that it can exist everywhere and among all age groups. The 10 or so years between the time I graduated high school and the time that I transitioned were loaded with bullies. Elders, family members, ministers, and anyone else deemed an authority figure for what is correct, whatever that means, can and often are bullies equivalent to any middle school tormentor. They can freely criticize whoever and whatever they want to, and socially they're above reproach. So many of my weakly held beliefs prior to transition they were just ones that I was bullied into. I was bullied for many, many years, both by the children in my school and the adults who surrounded me. I was bullied so much that I genuinely saw myself as less than. I learned to accept a role of passively swallowing whatever was given to me. And you know, if you're gonna do it, never do it passively. Eventually, after a lifetime of having any will whatsoever to resist beat out of me, I probably would have become such a bully myself. The thesis of this essay isn't that trans people are innately better than cis people. They aren't. Shitty trans people exist. But I, most certainly, am a better person for it.
Oh my god, god.
Oh my god, pumpkin spice lattes.
So, the perfect 1 a.m. coffee is a blend of instant blonde, instant hot chocolate, hot water, and, I don't know, like a generous splash of whole milk. It is like the perfect, cheap, easy, instant mocha. I don't know if that makes me basic, but God, it's so good. Does she really drink coffee that way? Or is she just trying extra hard to be that bitch, gripping a cup with 2 hands? When I came out as trans, I had been in what was nearly a 3-year relationship. In fact, just 3 months prior, I asked her father for permission to marry her. Look, I know how that sounds, and I get it, but I mean, have you been listening at all to me talk about the place I came from? She was my best friend, and very straight. A lot of people saw us as having the perfect relationship, but behind the veneer, we were really just very loving, very close besties than we ever had been boyfriend-girlfriend. So when I came out, it was first to her and not until some time after to anyone else. And when that happened, it was clear that that had been the source of all our problems. And we wouldn't be able to stay together any longer, at least in that capacity. It's a common refrain in the trans community. We continued, however, to live as roommates for 2 years after that, right up to the point that I first started to finish this script, which was like a year ago now. She's the one who held my hand and guided me through the world of womanhood, teaching me things I probably would have never learned otherwise. Even to today, with all that we've been through, she continues to be my very best friend. I bring up my ex to illustrate one final point, which is possibly the best thing about being trans in the first place. A newfound ability to appreciate the little things. Okay, look, I know that line reads very live, laugh, love, but just bear with me. When you have lived a life of being denied something so fundamental as your very identity, you become sort of accustomed to just not really enjoying anything, which sounds very sad, and it is, but to be honest, as sad as I generally was, there were many, many things that I didn't even realize I should be sad about. The hindsight that came with transition is the only thing to ever afford me that degree of clarity. It might sound cliche or silly or goofy, but nearly every single day now I have the conscious thought of, I am so happy that I'm a girl. Sometimes it comes out in the form of, I'm so glad I don't have to deal with that anymore. Sometimes it comes out as, I love that I get to enjoy this now. Sometimes it's as major as loving being able to talk to other women as a woman. Sometimes it's as minor as the feeling you get when you forget you're wearing makeup and catch a glimpse of yourself as you pass by a mirror. Very often, it comes down to relief at no one expecting me to enjoy or carry on a conversation about football. Once, I even found euphoria in buying a cute pencil pouch with a panda on it without fear of judgment. Whatever it is, even on the very worst days, even when it makes things more difficult for me than they would otherwise be, I always wake up thankful that I get to be a woman. And here is where my ex comes in. She is the one I always confide those feelings in, whether it's in the form of a message or a single line of conversation, to which she is often reflective and states something to the effect of,
honestly, I think that's so amazing. I've just never thought about it like that before, and you've really taught me how to appreciate being a woman. Thank you for that.
And now that we've got that line that I wrote, I'm going to be able to do something really funny by super cutting both of them together and seeing how wonderful the one is that you said. Yeah.
Whee!
I'm just going to have it recording. Also, the camera's going to be very unsteady, but although I
Do I look at the camera?
Yeah, no, it's really hot in here. Sun's out, guns out. I guess I can.
Will you be able to crop me later? My pants are on backwards. Patrons only.
Yeah, patrons only.
Patrons can see.
Okay.
Oh, are we rolling?
We're rolling, baby.
Well, I would just say during your transition and through your transition, I have learned to appreciate things about being a woman. Things I just never have ever had to think about before. So, like when you go to the bathroom with other girls and how you feel safe and protected like that, or just the way that we talk to each other as opposed to when you're talking to a guy, or what kind of conversations you would have and things that I would take for granted, but for somebody like you, how you just feel so appreciative of that. And you know, things I just have never really thought about before.
Yeah, that's true.
What was your line?
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, we have perfect stuff right now.
But I'm feeling unprepared.
Okay, wait. Want to show your cat too?
Meow.
Yeah.
Meow. That's Choo Choo, baby.
That's
She's
Choo
still
Choo,
with
baby.
us, though.